on a Saturday. My inbox this morning is nothing but people being like, I'm running really late. Is that you're like, you're the only like person to ever be late to a tech conference. It's fine. So thank you for coming to No Show 2012. Thank you for supporting like a somewhat weird, off the beaten path type of a professional development conference. I have a few notes, and then we're going to start with our kickoff with our fabulous keynote speaker. This event would not exist, and it certainly would not exist at MIT without the support and sponsorship of the Singapore Gambit MIT Game Lab. Our Singapore MIT Gambit Game Lab. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, sorry. And specifically Generoso Fierro, who is not here right now, but is here in spirit because you have no idea the amount of time that he put into getting us this conference space reserved. It was literally over a year. Also, my grandpa from Gambit for doing all of our logo design work for free. O'Reilly Media, which is sponsoring ebook stuff for all of you guys. You'll be getting an email from me after the conference with the code or URL or what have you, so you can go get a free like anything from O'Reilly. And then also to Game Loop Incorporated for being the like official sponsor thing. I'm looking at Darius like he's gonna help. But yeah, so this is like a Game Loop production or what have you, and a Game Loop joint. Is that? Yeah. And so thanks for like hiring me to run this weird conference for you guys. We do have a hashtag. This is the part where I would have slides for you, except that my house's sewage system backed up yesterday, so I did that instead. The hashtag is NoShow12. I think it was in an email. In the before times, I sent you an email. I just want to remind you guys that we are operating under what's known as the FriendDA policy, which isn't that like you can't tweet or anything like that. Just if you hear somebody saying something where you're like, man, like I just overheard somebody from like Turbine saying blah blah blah, like just don't, be cool, okay? Like just turn around and be like, that sounds really interesting. Let's have a face-to-face confidential conversation about that instead of like, let me blast that one-liner on Twitter and get everybody in trouble. You know, like I think it encourages a much more open, honest exchange if people don't have to be worrying about someone turning around and playing gotcha on the internet. So let's not do that to each other. Sound good? Yay! Awesome. Good morning. I know, it's really early. So we also have an attendee policy that is linked on our website if you need to review that. Everybody agrees to follow by that by being here and buying a ticket. We're all on the same page. That's great. We do have volunteers. I was going to get them really like livid, eye-poppingly sore, bright t-shirts, and then I decided I didn't want that this early in the morning, and so you don't have to look at that. But honor badges, if you see someone with a volunteer checkbox, and especially if they're like loitering around your door, checking badges, that is your like point person for if you have a problem, suggestion, concern, anything to report. They're most likely going to turn right around and tell me. So it's even faster if you just want to find me and tell me if you have any issues. Again, my name's Courtney. I'm really friendly. I've had a lot of coffee. I'm very alert and welcome any suggestions you have or criticism or whatever. I'm here to make sure you guys have a good event, so please don't be like, oh, I don't want to like bother Courtney right now. Bother me. It's really cool. We do have Wi-Fi. It is MIT Guest is the name of the network. I'm told that because we're on the third floor, we should have very clear, steady access all day. So even though the building's made of concrete, we're apparently should be all set. Should be very steady.
Actually, we're on the fourth.
We are on the fourth floor right now. Where am I? How are you? Schedules are in the back of your badge. So if at any time you're like, what's happening next? I need to know. This is really for me more than for you, but you benefit from that. And now I'm going to stop talking. Yay. And instead, Naomi Clark is going to start talking, and I'm going to read her bio to you really quickly. Naomi Clark has been working on games, virtual worlds, and digital toys for nearly 20 years, ever since helping to build MUDs, which are text-only online virtual worlds, as a teenager. As an editor of the landmark 90s website Word, Naomi co-designed City Fight 2000, one of the first multiplayer web games. She went on to produce and architect online games and digital building tools for LEGO. Over the last decade, Naomi has worked as a producer, game designer, and creative director for independent game studios such as Game Lab, Bluefang, and Fresh Planet. She has helped design and build everything from downloadable casual games to tactics RPGs for the post-D&D crowd, to educational web games for kids, Facebook games, and mobile phone reboots of retro classics. Her work has delved into workplace politics and identity, such as mismanagement, asynchronous competition, LEGO drum racing challenges, spooky social board game mechanics for Facebook, Dreamland, and the power of game design driven by a community of kids, GameStar Mechanic. Along the way, Naomi has blogged about gender and popular culture at Feminist, taught workshops and classes about games at the NYU Game Center and Person School of Design, played drums in a country band, and helped start the Sylvia Riviera Law Project, a collective nonprofit working for gender self-determination in the framework of social and racial justice. She currently lives with her girlfriend in Brooklyn, where she splits her work between consulting on numerous game projects and collaborating with the Brooklyn Game Ensemble on a new independent game. And now she's going to be our keynote for News for 2012. Please welcome Naomi Clark.
Thank you so much for getting up so early and being my guinea pigs for this series of ideas, which is sort of how I do every talk that I give. Because it's all sort of experimental, I definitely encourage you to come up and yell at me if you think that I'm horribly wrong about something. Not during the talk, but maybe afterwards. I never blush more than when I am having my own bio read to me, and I feel really embarrassed that I made it so long. But I want to say I'm super honored to be here and getting to launch the first no-show in the early morning. And I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about me, although Courtney already read my really long bio. Yeah, there's pictures. Or at least sort of there are pictures. So I make games for a living. And I make games because I really have to make games. I feel compelled to. This is what one of the first games that I worked on looked like in the early 90s. And then these are a couple more games that I worked on in the 90s, in the early days of the web. And then, you know, like Courtney was saying, I worked for LEGO for several years on various types of stuff with digital bricks. And since then, I've done a lot of different types of games for many different audiences on many different platforms, ranging from experimental stuff to very sort of commercial mainstream things, casual audiences, and so on and so forth. So, why am I here talking to you today? Well, I was very excited by the themes of No Show. So when I saw the call for submissions that Courtney put out, I immediately had a lot of thoughts buzzing around my head. And that result from the ever-expanding dialogue around games that's been going on, you know, the last 5-6 years especially. And so I was sort of thinking about all these different things, like, oh, wouldn't this be interesting to talk about? And I kind of held them all together and thought, wow, you know, I wonder if I could make a talk that kind of goes through what the sort of current terrain, the landscape, like all people and subjects that are buzzing. So this talk is a little bit like a tour, and maybe it reaches some conclusions too, but you know, when I looked at all of these different topics, I started to think, well, this doesn't sound like a talk, it sounds more like obsessed, middle of the night thoughts by an insomniac. Like, you know, it's just like, can't think about anything else. And so I thought, well, I need to focus somewhere. And I know that I didn't want to do this. I didn't want to do the, like, what is games, what's the definition of games, because there's too many people talking about this already. And I kind of feel like it's not really going anywhere, and I'm not even sure. I used to really like talking about this, right? I used to just be like, man, that's not a game. It doesn't have meaningful decisions in it, and you know, there's no lost state, so it's really a toy. And I used to get real persnickety about that stuff, and now I'm just not sure whether that kind of so-called intellectual rigor is actually useful or just a sort of a rigid limitation. And I have Commander here, who is one of the designers of Mass Effect, to thank for that, because he gave an impassioned rant at this year's Game Developers Conference where he urged everybody to just quit it. So I'm following his lead. Thank you, Mandir. And I should note that this is the first of a collectible pogs that are going to be in here on this talk. If you collect all of them, I don't know how you would do that, you will get some sort of prize. Okay, gamification. So this is what the real title of this talk is. What are games good for? And, in the following the words of the immortal song, are they maybe good for absolutely nothing? This is actually kind of, a more appealing answer than you might think. Although clearly we can come up with other answers as well. Although games have this weird quality, maybe they are not as utilitarian as other subjects. So you can ask, what are games good for, and sort of mull over it. If you ask something like, well, what are nuclear physics good for? You get a bunch of, semi-predictable answers. It's still different answers depending on who you ask. But some people will say, oh, that it's good for just, understanding the fundamental aspects of our universe and how they relate to each other. And the other people say, oh, in the future we might be able to have clean sources of sustainable energy. We just understand nuclear physics better and can, do hydrogen fusion. And then other people will totally just say right to my face, I think one of the greatest uses of nuclear physics was blowing your relatives up in Nagasaki because it ended the war sooner and saved lots of lives. So, it depends on the perspective you're taking, right? And what you're thinking about, whether you're thinking theoretically or practically and so forth. So I suspect there are probably a lot of answers for games too. These are teleological questions, right? This is the branch of philosophy that deals with what is the ultimate purpose of something. It's not the most popular branch of philosophy these days because people tend to acknowledge, maybe there's not just one answer to what something's for. But I think it's useful, especially because we talk a lot in game development about design. And design is kind of a teleological practice, right? Maybe it's the engineering of teleology somehow. And this is a rather famous definition of design. It's definitely not one that I would say I subscribe wholeheartedly to. But, it sort of makes sense that there are different kinds of designed objects in our environment everywhere. And the practice of designing these things is often seen as solving one sort of problem or another. So I was thinking about this, and then the other day, one of the game designers who I work a lot with, Eric Zimmerman, gave this quote in an interview to Kotaku. And he was talking about an interesting aspect of games, that we don't have one purpose or a really clear function that games are meant for, unlike people who are designing forks. There are a lot of different things you could do with games. And he's saying, we really have to pick what those are. He describes them as non-functional goals. I'm not sure if I would see this list of things that he's got in the middle of this paragraph as non-functional. But I definitely sort of take his point that there's not just one thing that you're going to do with a game, unlike a fork. So that means the question of what are games good for sort of expands as well. So if you really want to know a lot about the subject, oh, actually, here's the question. So if there's a problem, what is the problem that games are solving? Is it that there's no fun? We hit a point where there's a lack of fun. So we get a game and we'll solve that problem. Probably more complicated than that. If you really want to know about this, I definitely recommend this book by Ian Bogost, who is a philosopher, unlike me, which will become clearer as we go along in this presentation. He really delves into a lot of the nooks and crannies of what games can be used for. And but I think, I want to just take a major tour of what I think is going on right now, the different uses that games are being turned towards. So for instance, games for learning is one of the more traditional utilitarian purposes that games are harnessed for, in all sorts of ways, from really obvious things like teaching kids geography with a geography quiz, to sort of newer things like this is Jim G, who is at the University of Wisconsin, using systems like GameStar Mechanic, which I worked on to teach kids systems thinking, and do a bunch of studies about how games and learning work together. So that one's kind of obvious, somewhat well known, still a little controversial in some circles. Then of course you have Games for Change, which has really grown into a big movement over the last 6 or 7 years. And he's, one of the major public faces is Jay McGonigal, who is a real booster of the potential for games to potentially change the whole world, really alter the way people think, improve people's minds and bodies and relationships, everything. She really believes in the power of games, that they can be harnessed, at the same level as at splitting the atom, right? That our entire world could be transformed. Then, I think of this category as being a little different from Games for Change, because these smaller games almost function like political cartoons. They're not aiming to sort of like get you to raise your rate of recycling metal cans or anything like that. Instead, they deliver sort of like a powerful, punchy message on a particular topic and leave you with that after having sort of delivered their payload. And then there's another new category I like to throw games against change. I think that this is a category that's actually bigger than we think. So one example is Beat Up Our Anita Sarkeesian, a recent game. This was launched as an anti-change campaign, basically, because Anita Sarkeesian is a filmmaker who started raising money on Kickstarter for a series of videos about sexist tropes in video games. So she was sort of trying to address problems that she saw. And this offended some people so much, they had such sort of like rage against the temerity of that someone would attack their beloved games, that this guy over here on the right, whose real name, and at least I put on him there for your convenience, decided that she needed to be punished. So he made this game to sort of censure her and encourage people to beat up her likeness. Another example, is anyone here from Alchemy Labs? They're in Boston, right?
They also sleep in.
Oh, they sleep in, okay. Also, I think their game, Small Truck, is also for me a game against change, because it reinforces both sort of apathy, dismissal, it's callous towards immigrants, and it reproduces these stereotypes about Mexicans, such as the idea that they pop out babies frequently so that they can plant a foothold on this side of the US-Mexico border. So I consider that as like, okay, let's retrench some of the status quo. The purpose, whether intentional or not, is for things to stay the same. Then, okay, these guys look super happy. It's not really too hard to figure out why, because they're doing games for profit and making $1 billion. This, of course, is one of the most popular, widespread, dominant, landscape-shaping uses that games are put to. The main difference between these two games is that the AAA guy wears a suit and the Facebook guy wears a hoodie. So there's one category that's on here. This is Colleen Mack, a friend of mine who teaches at Parsons in New York. And last year at the Game Developers Conference, we were noticing that there were all of these discussions and conference tracks, everything popping up around these different games for movements. She said, well, what about games for games? Why don't we just have games for games? What happened to that idea? And it really stuck with me. And I thought, all of these things are kind of like someone noticed that games was like a Lego horse, right? And that they said one day, hey, there's like this big gap right in the middle there. What the hell? You know what we could do? We could like hook it up to a card and do things with it. We could put stuff on it and it'll like transport around things and deliver stuff for us. Plus there's an extra bonus, which is that we can gain some legitimacy now, because now we're actually doing something. Everyone thought that we were completely pointless. So games can clearly have something to prove, and having these purposes helps with that. Another even less flattering comparison would be to a virus, right? It exists only to pass along its message in the form of a nucleic acid that serves as its equivalent of DNA. And its entire structure is built in order to sort of clamp on and inject that into a cell. And so the game equivalent of that would be something like this. You sort of structure everything to work in a replicable, hang on and get the payload in there format. Whether your payload is like a political message or wanting someone to brush their teeth more, or some news that you want them to know about. And I think that this, people find viruses abhorrent somehow because they're this kind of form of life that has no purpose except to sort of replicate, so they do well in sort of sci-fi horror movies. But I think there's a similar horror that comes up with Facebook games like Castleville depicted here, which Jesper Juhl, another game theorist, has sort of said that he thinks of these as the video games of video games. Because when people who are in gaming culture talk about social games and Facebook games, they use the kind of language that people who don't like video games in general use about video games as a whole, right? They say like, these are just sort of like pointless reward machines, people sit in front of them doing nothing, you know, it's completely meaningless. And so my theory on top of Jesper's is like that's because these are laid bare the fact that games are just being used as a delivery mechanism. That it's just you know, a payload and some sort of a few behaviors being incented, and it's just too obvious. It's not sort of clouded behind a bunch of like nice cutscenes and graphics. So it lays bare some of this, what Eric calls the instrumentalization of games, the use of games for all these other purposes. But what is the alternative there, right? Like, what would a horse for its own sake, you know, without a gap in its back or a saddle slapped onto it? What does that mean for games? Well, let's go back to teleology for a second. So there's some sub-ideas underneath teleology, different kinds of purposes, extrinsic finalities and intrinsic finalities. Now, let's talk about these. So an extrinsic finality for a fork is that the fork has a purpose outside of itself. And that, as you might expect, it's going to fork something and then maybe fork it into somebody's mouth. And it needs something to fork. It needs something outside of itself. If a fork is floating through space on its own, it lacks its purpose. The whole reason for it to exist is separate from itself. Now you might say, okay, but wait, I'm sorry, I'm getting out of order. Intrinsic finalities, on the other hand, are things that you would find in a 8-year-old's notebook, at least if you were sort of a goofy hippie when you were 8 like me. Peace, love, and happiness, things that we think of as being causes in and of themselves. You do them for their own sake. Now you might say, okay, but wait, forks can have that too. When the designer's designing a fork, they might do something that's not about the function of the fork at all, but really they're trying to explore forkiness somehow, right? But the thing is, the fork is only a fork as long as you can still use it to eat. Now if you look at all these forks, they're still useful utensils. So you can say, okay, this is over there. But then you're like, hey, wait, Naomi, I found this fork that looks totally impossible to eat with. It's all curvy, that would just be a pain in the ass. But this is a trick because that's actually a napkin holder. That's tricky, designers. So what is the intrinsic finality for games? So we have all of these things that we know are like, we're using games for something else. We could even add some other things on here. Behavior modification, that's kind of what gamification is all about. Or interactive simulations, like the whole point of war games and other types of simulated exercises that are game-like. But what's over here? Now, one pat answer would be, well, it's fun. That's why you make a game, and that it's fun. But I don't want to go there just yet because there's new ideas that have cropped up just recently. Some of you may not be surprised to hear that. Is this games for art's sake? Now, I think we need to be careful here because there's a difference between games for art and games as art. Games as art is one of these things that is often held up as an intrinsic finality, that art exists for its own sake. But if you say games for art, and you are using games in order to deliver your artistic message, then that starts to look a lot like instrumentalization again. So, basically, you could put different things on this card, right? Like maybe these are something boring and useful, like you're teaching kids about the tax system. But instead, you get really excited because you're like going to put your totally amazing artistic vision on that card. And something that the world cannot possibly live without because it's like your self-expressive genius. And, to move past that, this is Richard the Marchand, who's one of the nicest guys in all of video games. I regret having him right after that terrible sequence. But I noticed that in an interview that he gave recently, he described game mechanics as a carrier signal for the sort of story and emotional experience he's trying to deliver. And I was like, oh no, Richard, you're going to the dark side. Because I know that he understands game mechanics really well too. And the other people in the interview were Michael Salmon and Oria Harvey, who are from a production company called Tale of Tales. Now, if Richard is going to the dark side, these guys are they're like the Emperor or something. They really dislike games sort of on principle. In fact, they have a movement called Not Games. But I love their work. They do and say things that nobody else does, because they have this sort of antagonistic relationship to a lot of what everyone else thinks of as making games work. So Michael Sandman is where these quotes come from. So he doesn't really believe that games on their own have any real expressive power. He sort of wants to reduce the amount of gameness going on in the things that he's making. He's kind of leery of it. I like reading his blog because he's always struggling with it. It's kind of like, watching someone who hates horses have to work with horses. He's got his whip out, and he's like, people are interacting too much, I hate it. And that's literally what this guy's saying. So I think it's really interesting that there's this terrain that he's kind of one far end, and there's a lot of game developers out there who really dislike him. I think for similar reasons, as they feel comfortable at social games, because he's kind of pointing out, look, we can just use this, we can just put these explosives in this rocket like a payload. And I'm I don't care about any of this other shit. It's stupid. I just want to use it to get that into that person. I want to put my art in them. John Blow is another good example of this. Someone whose work I greatly admire. Of course, very well known for his game Braid. Now, he recently appeared in Indie Game Review. This is what 90% of his appearance in Indie Game Review is. I don't know why. I think that filmmakers did it. I don't blame him. I think it's really weird. And, so he talks about Braid, and he actually says he was really sad. It broke his heart to put Braid out there because he put so much of his personal feelings into it, and his ideas and sort of deeply encoded message. It's kind of laced through the game in these little snippets of text and stuff. But that nobody really got it. He didn't feel like anyone understood. They didn't realize what he was saying. And the Indie Game, the movie directors, who put him saying this right next to this video of the rapper Soulja Boy playing Braid. And Soulja Boy is oh, this game's stupid. He's like Mario, but he's in a suit. He can rewind time. What's going on? Which is basically a description of Braid, right? But John Blow's I don't understand. And all of John Blow's fans are how can you not appreciate the genius? But sort of, nobody really got what John Blow was trying to say. He's kind of been hinting at it more recently in this interview we did with The New Yorker. But he said all these reviewers didn't get it, and true confession time, I'm one of the reviewers. This screenshot of this review that I wrote is in the movie during the part where he's saying I love this, people didn't understand me. So I wrote this review where I sort of, was taking note. I did a feminist reading of this game, and I said, there's something really creepy going on here with this character. I'm not sure what John Blow is trying to say, and he used to pop up on these sites. He used to be you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, and I'm totally serious. And he said that on some other interview that oh yeah, some feminist lady did a reading and it was completely wrong. But it's interesting, I was what do you mean it's completely wrong? Because I believe in what's called the intentional fallacy. It's a theory of looking at literature first and then other, works of art and creative expressions that says what the author intended to put into the work, you can't really just tell necessarily from the work. And that maybe is not where the meaning comes from, right? And so the school of thought that developed this theory went on to evolve into a reader response theory of media, where the interpretation of a work isn't fixed. It's not sort of just delivered by the author. What this adds up to is you don't get to decide what your game is about on your own. But this is something that other cultural forms that have a rich history of criticism and reviewing and so forth, they kind of understand this. That Steven Spielberg doesn't just get to say you're wrong. That's not what my movie is about. But in video games, even the brightest people that we have, John Blow, they don't sort of know this yet. And it may be because we're just sort of spreading our wings and trying to fly, or maybe because there are a lot of people who haven't been exposed to the same kind of media criticism or are coming really from a different perspective. So let's move on to Games for Fun. This is Brian Moriarty, who made some of the games I'm fondest of from my childhood. And there's this Games for Fun approach. This would seem to be the least controversial traditional model, but it's a little bit now has evolved into, look, don't mess with it, especially in the face of all of these other types of games that are appearing. And you hear a lot of people saying, look, why are you trying to be art? What's the point of that? I don't need that, artist pretentious crap. I don't want it. Don't mess with the things that are entertaining me. I'm sort of sucking on this teat of titillation and enjoyment and reward. Why are you trying to disrupt that? Now, it would be easy to just totally dismiss this and say, like, this is a little bit depressing, right? It's like, oh, instead of something else, I put just a keg of beer on the back of the horse. And it's like, whoever wants beer can just like pony up and like stick their mouth under the nozzle. Although, I have deep respect for the tradition of fun in games, and most of the games, like I think practically all of the games I've made, have been oriented towards trying to produce fun in one way or another. But, the more I think about it, the more I think like, okay, if this is games, we're all in society, then we're basically like the pleasure slave that's scantily clad, like putting grapes into Caligula's mouth, and that's our job in the world, and, it sort of sucks, and it feels like it sucks more now that we realize, hey, wait a second, there's a bunch of other stuff going on. Maybe I don't necessarily believe in using games in order to do job training, but the fact that games have that power means that we don't have to just sit here and do this. We could do more, and that's where I think some of the ambitions towards games as art have come from too. But games really have evolved in the direction of fun for a very long time, and we're up there with other very early forms of human expression. That's a really early flute down there on the left. But games have evolved for a very specific niche. Our systems of randomness evolved out of fortune-telling systems. And, I had to think I started wondering, well, what role did games play in the evolution of the human brain? Because we know that when written language first appeared, also many millennia BC, that there were really changes that could be discerned, I'm not sure of the exact scientific method, in the structure of human brains and in how cognitive processing was happening. And that's because there was suddenly this new type of thing that people were thinking about. So I feel like this really sort of points towards the fact that games have been a part of who we are as humans for a really long time, and that maybe we've evolved together with them. We also know that play has been around since before human beings. Lion cubs play so that they can practice or do something that's in a consequence-free zone that will be similar to something else that they do for real later. So, at what point did play turn into games for human beings? And what does that say about us as a species? What does it say about games? Maybe games are like the cultural equivalent of mitochondria, right? Maybe they've been sort of evolving inside us. I don't know whether they came from somewhere else, like mitochondria did, evolving from bacteria that were originally not part of human beings. But they've been changing and mutating and kind of becoming very specialized for this niche of producing fun, of providing us with entertaining distractions and ways of using our brain in our downtime. So like the sort of cordyceps fungus on the upper left that implants itself into an ant and then sort of messes with the ant's brain so that the ant suicidally climbs up a tall flower to let the spores of the fungus be carried away by the wind before the ant totally dies. Or, like crows that have adapted to coexist with human beings. Maybe games, the reason that they are like what they are now is because they've evolved for a niche in human society, a particular function. So is this a teleology? Do games exist to provide pleasure for us? I would actually call this a teleonomy, slightly different term, sort of more popular than teleology, which implies an original cause. Teleology is like Kirk Cameron saying, oh, the banana was created for you by God to be easy to open. Teleonomy is looking at how a complex process of evolution might produce different kinds of animal and plant species. And that, we say things like, well, the cavefish is blind, actually that's not an example, sorry, the bat has sonar in order to be able to perceive things in the dark. And that wasn't like somebody decided to give the bat sonar, it's the result of this system. Right? So what's the teleology of games? Well, here's an interesting idea. So our brain capacity was going up and up over millions of years. And Richard Dawkins, who's an evolutionary biologist and a prominent atheist, who's sort of very much more on the teleonomic side, he did a talk recently about purpose. So he describes natural selection processes as being archaeopurpose. And it's definitely teleonomic. He doesn't believe that any other director or an alien astronaut was deciding how all this goes. But based on the environment and natural selection, different things happen, like bats have sonar or see in the dark. But then the human brain evolved a different type of purpose, neopurpose. And this refers to our ability to have adaptive decision making. Like, we can not just do things the same way every time. We can form a goal, like, I want to get that coconut over there, and then decide to abandon it if there is a tiger in the way. And we can do this in all sorts of flexible ways and taking various considerations into account. And this starts to sound really familiar, right? This process of like, oh, I'm adopting goals, I'm like figuring out a strategy. It sounds to me, a lot like a basic cognitive processes that go into playing a game. Because a lot of that has to do with iterative decision making and goal adoption. In fact, those are some of the things that really make games work and power them, in addition to pleasure. So here's my story. This is completely a shot in the dark. Although partially based on Richard Dawkins' work. So archaeopurpose led to the development of more and more complex brain structures through natural selection, right? Then brains developed the ability to form these neopurposes, actually sort of deciding to do different things. And this is how human culture started to evolve so quickly at some point, much faster than evolutionary changes could. And Dawkins points out that we have to be able to be both flexible and tenacious. Like, we really have to decide, like, are we going to change our minds a little bit? Are we going to adjust our course? Or are we going to really decide to be stubborn about it? Both things that also play a major role in game strategy. So then human beings started making things that mimicked archaeopurpose, right? Like we decided to make a neopurpose that we wanted clothing because we don't have fur. Or eventually we're going to try and mimic the way a bird flies with wings by making devices that work in a similar way. Eventually, we even make objects that have their own capacity to adjust and reprogram their own goals. They decide to do something. They have if-then statements, and those are called computers. And then when there were enough computers, suddenly we had a huge boom in leisure activities that also involved goal selection and adaptive decision-making and strategy, and those are called video games. So we have an interesting sort of spiral upwards in this whole process, going all the way back to the original, one of the things that separates human beings from our nearest ancestors, which is the development of the structures in our brain that let us do decision-making and adopt goals in a more sophisticated and flexible way than other species can. And we've reproduced this and then sort of created training labs for it. And that may be a big part of what the teleology of games is. Does that mean that we should sort of pursue that whole hog? Well, I don't know. Our history, or the way that we've evolved lots of things that are not necessarily adapted in the modern world, right? We can sort of decide where we go from here. So for instance, what does this say about games? This is Frank Lantz. He's one of my favorite game theorists. He was the designer of Drop 7, and he wrote an essay at one point about this game Galcon, in which he described it as the mind of war made present to itself. And later on, he generalized that to all games, saying that games have this quality of thought made present to itself. Which is a way of, I think, saying some similar things about how games and the human brain interact, right? That when we engage in a system, we're adopting the system's goals, principles, and rules into ourselves. And we see ourselves in the system, and we see the system in us. And it's like looking into our own minds and watching our minds as they jump through hoops or engage in things which we wouldn't normally do in everyday life. It's a disruption, it's a change, and it's a moment for us to watch our brains in process. I think this is an incredibly important part of brains. It's maybe almost like a type of biofeedback mechanism. And it comes out really strongly in sort of like quiet moments in games where you pause and reflect for a second. So this reflective quality is something that I, and other people, I think Richard LaMarchand, who's in the presentation earlier, is also really interested in this. And, the guys over at USC and the folks who made Journey and Flower and Flow are also really interested in these reflective experiences, that game company. But there's also something a little bit missing here about games. And I think that, when Frank talks about the mind being made present to itself, it sounds a lot to me like a sort of Rene Descartes exercise where I'm just sort of sitting and contemplating by myself. And it does have this quality of single-player games, which of course have only been around for a short time in the whole history of games. And I'm more of a fan of the man on the right, who is Emmanuel Levinas, a theorist who wrote an awful lot about the need to face and come face to face with the other. And the other, what he means by that is both other human beings being aware that there are people outside of us who have different motives and intentions, and understanding how ethics and empathy arise through those interactions, but also social others, right? Outgroups, different nations, and so forth. And there's something really integral to games about that too, because games need players. Games can't survive without players and without someone to play them. A game is not really the same as a text sitting there with words in it. It's really just a set of instructions and pieces without a whole lot of rhyme or reason. There are no dynamic processes happening. And games need players, I think, in a very different way than any other creative form needs an audience. And players, like we were talking about before, help to create the meaning of games. And you could say this is true of film, of literature, and so forth. But players are very, very actively involved in games, right? In fact, a player can, with one stroke of a decision in their brain, change one game into a completely different game, just by deciding that they don't care about the goals that have been set for them by the rules of the game. Right? So if I'm playing Risk with you and you're trying to win, and I decide, I don't care about winning anymore, I'm going to play Kingmaker for someone else, or I'm just going to act randomly. Suddenly we're not playing the same game anymore, even though we're on the same board, and it actually may completely screw you up, right, and make it impossible for you to win. So players can actually seize the reins of games in many ways, right? I can decide to totally ignore what the designers obviously told me to do. I can try to do a speed run or a pacifist run or something like that instead. So I tend to think of games as being less like texts which are delivered from an author to a reader, and maybe a little bit more like something like music, which has to be performed. Single-player games, you might say, okay, there's no other player that you're confronting in those games, but you're always playing against a system that's been created by a designer and sometimes a programmer, and you're coming to terms with the rules of the system that were laid out there. So there's always a sense of playing against the house. And in engaging with those rules, you also end up facing someone else, not just your own mind. And in fact, you start to also come face to face with cultural fantasies and commonly held ideas about how systems work that come from a much higher level than just one designer or just you as a player. So for instance, going back to Galcon, Galcon is not really a true representation or even like a scientifically modeled one about the mind of war or warlike strategy and desires. It's one guy's reflection on everything that he knows about war, right, that would come from a broader culture. Similarly, Call of Duty is described as having brutally realistic violence, but it doesn't really represent what war is really like, right? Another great game thinker, Darius Gomi, described these, especially Call of Duty, as a cultural fantasy of war, right? So in playing these games, we come face to face, not just with our own minds, not just with the other player, not even just with the designer of the system that we're engaging with, but with everything that's been absorbed into those human beings by the larger by our larger society and culture. So where do we go from here? Well, Frank Lentz would say, we really need to look at games as a life practice, not just a sort of product that I deliver to you and you read and you absorb as if it was a book or a film, but games that can be played for 100 years and that will still be played in a century. And he uses sports as a model for this. I think this is one really interesting and different from the mainstream way of looking at games, because it takes us away from looking at games as media objects. And it starts to make them look a little bit more like integral parts that you would adopt into your life. Things that would have much more impact on your thought processes and what you do with your life than any single movie or book might. Another thing is looking at games as a conversation. This is Dan Cook, the designer of games like Triple Town and Realm of the Mad God. He is really keen on seeing games as conversation. So instead of this authorial model where the designer is sort of handing it down for it to be absorbed, the designer is just one participant among many, and games evolve over time, change like they used to when games were mostly folk creations. So maybe this gets us eventually towards something more like sheet music, right? Where one composer may write this, but there are so many different ways of playing this tune, right? I could give you a heavy metal rendition or a Dean Martin rendition of this song, or I could sing it traditionally. And it really depends, the expression is up to me, even though it was written a long time ago by someone else. But it has to be performed, it needs a player. So for a long time, games have been looking at literature and film to be this kind of story medium. And I wonder whether we need to think about it more like a performative medium. Finally, I want to wrap up. I know I'm probably running over. This is Anna Anthropy again. And she is really spearheading this drive with her book, Rise of the Video Game Scenesters, for this sort of what I think of as an expansive game movement. It's not just that anybody can and should make a game, or that more people from underrepresented populations should make games, but that really anything could be a game. That we have an expansive idea of what a game is, what the subject matter is, that sort of games infuse lots of aspects of our life. And I think, that's the way that games are going to need to deal with becoming, with their own problems of otherness, right? Because currently, game making is still relatively restricted to a narrow segment of the population. I'm a real oddity in the game industry as a queer woman of color, and even in this presentation, here's the sort of POG collection, and I thought, okay, who's here in my POGs among all these sort of thinkers and people writing about games and making interesting games? Well, I've got 4 women in this presentation. I probably should have put Courtney in, since she was the woman who, in the early side of all the
I'm
questions.
a producer, I don't make games, come on.
Well, Bobby Kotick and Mark is right here too. And there are only 2 queer game writers that I know, although maybe there are more, and I don't know. I tried to investigate all these people as much as I could for the interest of science. There are a couple people of color, and I was like, oh, we have to put the Persian guy in. So, but it's, to me, this was shockingly small, and and I was trying to think about it, but also sort of go with what ideas I was really plucking out of there to want to talk about. And this is gaming's problem with the other, that in the entrenched mode of just wanting to suck on the teat of fun and not have that threatened. It's disturbing to think about change for a lot of people who are heavily invested in games, because I think there's a subtle awareness that when the gates are thrown more wide open to more different kinds of people, and more different kinds of things are maybe even considered as games, that games will continue to evolve as they have been, along with the human brain, and that games themselves will change somehow in ways that we can't predict, because so many different people are bringing something new to them. And game makers with disabilities, I just totally had no idea about that one. That's the last thing. And the end. Thank you.
We're not really going to be doing a Q&A at all during during this conference because I hate Q&A, and it's my conference, so. However, this is Naomi. She's very friendly and approachable, and we're gonna take like a 10-minute break. So if you have any burning questions, you can talk to her. And we also have like a lunch, so there's after the conference, there's a lot of conversational time available.
I'll be here.
Yeah, she'll be here. So we're gonna take a quick like 10-minute break. So we'll start back up. It is 10:20 right now, so we'll kick off at 10:30 with the next talk. Go do whatever you want until then, or hang out here and watch us set up the next laptop.
Wait, so are you